And now I'd like to welcome Professor Adam Mead, who's going to talk to us about the COVID research updates.
Well, hello everyone, my name is Adam Mead. I'm a haematologist at the University of Oxford, and I'm going to give you an update on clinical research into the coronavirus infection, particularly focusing on new therapies and vaccines in development. But one of the first things to remember when you're looking for new information about the coronavirus is be careful about misinformation, particularly from this man. So there's a lot of misinformation about, including new therapies, misinformation about vaccines, misinformation about masks, and so on and so forth. So you have to make sure you go to reputable sources. The way we find new therapies, and in fact, the progress has been really remarkable on this through international effort, particularly from the UK, is through clinical trials. And the UK is really leading the way here. And these have been developed incredibly quickly through the repurposing of already available drugs. So that means we're taking drugs that are already approved to treat other diseases to see if they are effective to treat coronavirus. And broadly, the drugs that are being tested fall into three categories, and I'll talk through some of these. Antiviral treatments, anti-inflammatory or immune therapy type of treatments, and blood thinning treatments. And the idea is all of these can either stop the replication or block the virus or block consequences of the viral infection. And the UK in particular, thanks to the NHS and our centralised national health system and National Institute for Health Research, have really led the way in this clinical research effort, and internationally have made some of the biggest contributions to our understanding of new therapies. And that is mostly through this trial, the recovery trial, which was so far quite remarkably, given that it's only been open for about 3 months now, has already recruited over 12,000 participants at over 170 different sites. So I'm going to talk through some of the therapies that have been tested. And there are a bewildering number of these repurposed therapies that are being tested for treatment of coronavirus. I'm going to focus on some of these. So corticosteroids, treatment that's been around for decades and in the headlines quite recently. Interferon, of course, a treatment that many people with myeloproliferative neoplasms will be aware of. An antiviral treatment called rendezvous, and some anti-inflammatory treatments, tocilizumab, and I'm also going to mention a convalescent plasma that is being tested in the recovery trial. But the first thing to talk about is probably the earliest treatment that was proposed to be an effective treatment for coronavirus infection was hydroxychloroquine, which is an anti-malarial treatment that has been around for many decades. And Donald Trump and Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, have both taken this drug on the basis of zero evidence that it works. So here is a couple of examples of clinical trials. The best quality data, and many of you might have taken part in these types of trials, comes from randomized trials, where you randomly assign patients either to a control group where they do not receive the treatment, or a treatment group where they do. And that gives you the gold standard evidence. Always be cautious of any trials that report just one arm of a study without any kind of what we call control group, because that can be very, very biased. So what these curves show you is the event-free survival of patients who were randomized either to receive no hydroxychloroquine in blue or hydroxychloroquine in red. And you can see that the patients who received hydroxychloroquine in a non-significant way are doing slightly worse from those that did. And there are many different trials showing this. So it's clear that hydroxychloroquine is not a, in inverted commas, game changer for the treatment of this disease. One treatment that does look quite interesting is more of an immune than an antiviral therapy, but it could be classified as either, is interferon beta. So interferon alpha is a treatment that's often used for the treatment of myeloproliferative neoplasms. Interferon beta is in the same family of treatments. Actually, in these trials is given in inhaled formulation. And there's a number of studies now that have been reported showing that the treatment group, so those that receive interferon beta, manage to clear the virus more effectively than those patients in the light blue color in these curves that did not receive that treatment. So that looks like quite a promising treatment. I think most folks are thinking at the moment it is probably a good treatment early on in the course of the disease to prevent the deterioration of patients to more severe forms of coronavirus infection, and not a good treatment for later stages. Another treatment that has been in the headlines is rendezvous, which is an antiviral treatment originally developed for the treatment of Ebola, but repurposed for the treatment of coronavirus. And there was one disappointing randomized trial that did not show a benefit of remdesivir treatment in terms of the improvement rate, but this was quite a small study run in China that failed to recruit because the epidemic was kept under control in China, and you can see a marginal benefit but non-statistically significant. But the National Institute for Health in the United States ran a much bigger study and did show a highly statistically significant benefit for patients receiving this antiviral treatment. It seems to be patients who receive it quite early on in the disease course who benefit. So they recover and are discharged from hospital earlier than those patients treated with placebo, with a suggestion, albeit non-statistically significant, of a benefit in terms of the mortality rate, the risk of dying as a result of coronavirus infection. Really, the most successful trial to date came out of the UK. This was a randomized study testing the anti-inflammatory treatment dexamethasone, randomized study between usual care, dexamethasone treatment, overall showing a clear mortality benefit. This was a simple trial just looking at the chance of the patient being alive, highly statistically significant because this was a huge study of many thousands of patients. But notably, this treatment seems to be most effective in the patients who have more severe disease, either requiring ventilatory support or oxygen therapy, showing highly statistically significant benefit, but no benefit in patients who do not require oxygen therapy. So something for the later stages of the disease. Tocilizumab is another anti-inflammatory treatment that has shown some promise. Roxolitamide, many patients with MPN will be aware of, is a JAK2 inhibitor. This is also being tested in clinical trials, some of which are in the UK, to treat more severe forms of coronavirus infection. Interestingly, this is a non-randomized study, but still I think of interest that patients with coronavirus, as you've probably heard, seem to be at particular risk of developing blood clots. And patients that receive anticoagulation in hospital, particularly the sickest patients, seem to be at lower risk of developing blood clots than those that did not receive anticoagulation. So there are randomized trials now testing this approach for them. Antibody therapies are being developed, so they are either being engineered, so in the laboratory actually making the antibodies and making antibody therapies, and there are a number of these that have now been fully developed and are going into clinical trials. The faster way to develop antibodies as a therapy is actually to take convalescent plasma from people that have recovered from coronavirus infection and have developed natural antibodies, and you can take those antibodies by blood donation and test those as a treatment for coronavirus. And that is one of the arms of the recovery study that is currently recruiting. One of the interesting things in terms of natural immunity is there appears to be a lot of people in society as a whole who have not been exposed to COVID-19 who do appear to have some natural immunity against the virus. One recent study published just a couple of days ago suggests that about 1/3 of the population already have some T cells, that's the cellular part of the immune system, against the coronavirus protein. So that is a bit of good news, I think, in terms of the likelihood that we actually have broader immunity in the community than we might otherwise have expected on the basis of antibody tests alone. So finally, I want to talk about vaccines, which are, I think, the best hope for us to have an exit strategy, if you like, from the coronavirus pandemic. There are many vaccines that are in development. Typically, the vaccine development process takes many, many years, usually 5 to 6 years as a minimum, in order to have a functional and operational vaccine that can be used as a public health measure. In the coronavirus pandemic, that has been accelerated to a really remarkable degree. There are over 160 vaccines in development, and remarkably, 3 of those are really leading the way and are already in later stage clinical trials. One of them comes from the University of Oxford, and already over 6,000 people have been randomized. This vaccine, as shown here, has been shown to induce very strong immune responses in patients that receive the vaccine, to a similar level to those seen from patients who are recovering from viral infection. And because of these strong preliminary data, we are still awaiting actual, what we would say, efficacy data. So whilst we know the vaccine induces immune responses, we do not know whether it protects from coronavirus in humans. We do not know whether it reduces the risk of death if you do get coronavirus infection. That will require a much bigger study, which is underway in the UK with thousands of participants, and also in Brazil. The challenge in the UK is that there is thankfully not enough coronavirus about at the moment to answer this question, which is why they opened the study in Brazil. On the basis of the encouraging data of these immune responses, the University of Oxford and the UK government have already struck a deal with AstraZeneca to develop and produce up to 1 billion doses of this particular vaccine. But there are other vaccines. The Oxford vaccine is a so-called adenovirus vaccine, so it is a live virus vaccine, and that has got some potential problems associated with it. There are other vaccines in development, and there was a very recent publication on the Moderna. This is a US vaccine, which is the so-called mRNA vaccine, again showing similar immunogenicity, so a similar ability to induce an immune response. Here are the controls who didn't receive the vaccine, very strong antibody responses in patients that received the mRNA vaccine. So many very promising vaccine candidates. The challenge is simply to run a very large trial to prove that it prevents infection or prevents severe infection or complications of the infection. And that's what the researchers are grappling with at the moment. But still, remarkable progress has been made. So that's everything I wanted to say, and there'll be a chance to ask questions about my presentation during the Q&A session that will be coming up soon. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Adam, for such a useful talk. This is so relevant to all our lives at the moment.